as Deputy Prime Minister to get the government. I just told you the truth.
Rudd backers want Mr Beazley to go quietly without...
So the current leadership's not cutting through.
We will not vote for a party that's eating itself alive. We, in
the last week of Parliament. In politics, they call it the killing season.
A showdown in the caucus room is inevitable.
To improve the party's position with voters.
Are split in this leadership vote.
John Howard will win the next election unless...
Labor leader Kim Beazley is about to be overthrown.
It's a very, very sobering and lonely walk as you walk down the corridor in Parliament House, those stark hospital-like walls towards the leader's office, and almost hoping that the walk will be a little longer than it is.
It's a big emotional thing to do, to challenge the leadership of your political party. There's nothing pleasant about it, there's nothing fun about it. It's, you know, quite a horrible, gut-wrenching process.
And then you walk in the door, and Kim had this marvellous PA sitting at the desk. She had tears streaming down her face because she'd been in politics a long time, and she knew what this meant.
Did you recall that scene when Julia Gillard came to see you in 2010?
Do I recall it?
Did it flash through your mind all those years later?
No. Julia was my loyal deputy. And I didn't believe she would do that until that point.
Having announced their intention to challenge, Rudd and Gillard flew to Victoria for a media event in a vineyard outside Melbourne. There'd been months of leadership speculation. Now the two most ambitious Labor politicians of their generation were out in the open.
The whiteness, the brightness of the spotlight did strike me very, very strongly. Oh, you got hit in the head then, didn't you?
I think what we were both adjusting to was the fact that we were now a duo, the dynamic duo, and that was kind of fun.
How do you think Team Gillard and Team Rudd will go on Monday?
Well, this is going to be tight.
If Mr Rudd isn't successful, would you consider your own tilt for the leadership?
Well, we're not contemplating that. We're obviously aiming to win on Monday, and all of our efforts this weekend will be directed at that.
Thank you very much.
I had the shits big time with what Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard were then up to. After the 2004 calamity, where the caucus saw fit to install Mark Latham, and Labor lost both houses of Parliament, the Senate and the House of Reps, I thought, you know, fuck this, to be frank about it. I'm sick of it.
Greg Combet was very angry with what you and Kevin Rudd were doing. He said that you were destabilising Kim. Is that how a leadership challenge normally works?
Yes, you know, it is. I can understand Greg's perspective. He was leading the trade union movement, and the movement was rolling out an incredibly sophisticated campaign about work choices.
A clear choice.
He thought we were basically on track for a victory. I was more anxious.
The momentum was with the challengers. Kim Beazley and his deputy were struggling to hold them back.
We had worked very, very hard on the numbers over the weekend, both of us on the phones.
Okay, good.
Phone calls were flurrying around, people checking on support.
Hello? Sure, no problems.
All right.
Was counting, double counting, rechecking.
Yeah, okay.
Bye.
By Monday, Kevin Rudd had secured enough support to win the leadership.
Your voice sounds a little bit croaky. Have you been working overtime?
I think if you spend the last 3 days on the telephone non-stop, that's what happens to your voice.
As Labor MPs arrived for the vote, few realised that Deputy Leader Jenny Macklin had decided to stand aside. Why did you make that decision?
I knew Julia wasn't going to stop. She would continue until she won, and I didn't think that was good for the Labor Party.
Kevin Rudd won by a margin of 10 votes. Julia Gillard was unopposed. The Christian from Queensland's right and the atheist from the Victorian left were Labor's new leadership team.
It was, by all accounts, by all measures, a marriage of convenience, but a smart marriage in the interests of the party.
So in that sense, not a love match?
If you're looking for love, don't go into politics.
There was no Kirribilli-style agreement between them to guarantee Gillard's succession.
I think Julia always wanted to be the leader of the Labor Party. So did Kevin.
Thank you. But there was a deal to give Kevin Rudd 2 goes at winning government.
Getting us back into government in 2007 was a big ask. We needed to win a lot of seats. So clearly Kevin wanted to know that he would be supported for more than one shot, and I was prepared to say that.
From the beginning, they marketed themselves as an inseparable couple, laughing off any suggestion of tension.
Have you two ever said a bad word about each other?
We've had political disagreements, but we've never had a personal dispute.
Imagine you can't stand each other in private, that you bag each other. That's just absolute nonsense.
We've never had a crossword or a difficult moment.
No backstabbing?
Absolutely no backstabbing.
Only now is Gillard prepared to talk about bitter disagreements behind the scenes.
I was the convener of our Parliamentary Tactics Committee as Manager of Opposition Business.
It comes after the following one.
Yes. Kevin was always very anxious to, strut his stuff in question time. But I wonder, given the length of that question, whether you just finished. And tactics hadn't gone his way. I'd taken a view about something else forming the issue of the day. And after the tactics meeting broke up, he very physically stepped into my space, and it was quite a bullying encounter. It was a menacing, angry performance.
That is utterly false. Utterly, utterly false.
Do you recall any angry exchanges with her?
Never. Never with Julia. Including on the night that she marches into the office to announce the coup. I said to her repeatedly, but Julia, you're a good person. Why are you doing this?
I thought that side of his character, the very, anxious, I must be in the media, I must shine in Parliament today, that side of his character would fall away when he became Labor leader, and there was no more fighting for the spotlight. The spotlight was well and truly on him.
The 2007 ALP conference. Kevin Rudd's first chance to talk to the party as leader.
My name's Kevin, I'm from Queensland, I'm here to help.
He was not from central casting for a Labor leader.
Friends.
He was from a rural background, an academic, public servant, diplomat.
We are approaching today.
He was something new. He was something different.
While Gillard, the former union lawyer, had deep party roots, Rudd's challenge was to convince the party faithful that he was one of them.
Labor values are Australian values. This is what Ben Chifley meant 57 years ago when he talked of Labor and the light on the hill.
It's unusual in Labor history that a leader would come through with so little historical engagement with the union movement and without knowing the leaders of the union movement.
As someone who'd never grown up in the trade union movement, obviously they viewed me with some suspicion.
You don't get from Nambour Public to the Lodge without being a very, very tough operator. And he did it the hard way, quite frankly. He didn't do it with a kind of, with the factional godfather pushing him all the way through.
Because he'd been very much an outsider to the organisation, he set about becoming well known to all of the key players across the various groupings in the party. He identifies very methodically the sort of people that he needs to have contact with, what influence they may have, and then works very hard, night and day, to cultivate all of those contacts. He is probably one of the most effective networkers I've ever encountered or seen in operation.
Hey, brother. I had an office in the Labor Council building in the national office of the AWU, and you'd often see Kevin walking in and out of level 9 and going to Trades Hall and courting all those power brokers.
Labor's power brokers made the hard political calculation that Kevin Rudd was their best chance to beat Liberal Prime Minister John Howard.
He'd been enormously successful in Australian politics and seen off so many of my predecessors. And so I had no view at all that we would necessarily win in the election. None at all.
That was Rudd's core insight, was that he had to be, forget about being the destroyer of Howard, he had to be the son of Howard. It was to effectively to organise an orderly transition from Howard to Howard's successor, and his name was Kevin Rudd. And it was brilliant.
The task now was selling Rudd, not as a traditional Labor man, but as a leader attuned to the values of modern Australia.
This is the part of country Australia where my parents raised me.
The country had moved on from that old school factional Labor being about the working class. It now needed to be a more aspirational picture, and he fitted that perfectly.
The unofficial election campaign began straight away.
Kevin's campaign in 2007 was one of the best I've ever seen.
Kevin Rudd!
Mind you, I worked my guts out.
One more please.
You guys locals or from elsewhere?
No, I don't like him. You've said it'll be fun playing with John Howard's mind for a while.
In the morning, he'd be joking around with Joe Hockey on Sunrise.
Evan, how are you?
And by night, he'd be talking foreign policy on Late Night.
We've got to prevent nuclear weapons proliferation in our own region. To hide.
You had somebody who was just completely spanning every aspect of communications in a way that no other politician in the country could.
But after the break, one of my favourite things.
He was a formidable force, and it was a combination of both his capacity for discipline, but also his capacity to broadcast warmth. And it was an incredible skill to watch.
What about the polls? You've edged closer to Mr Howard as preferred Prime Minister.
You could see the Libs pulling their hair out in anger and frustration that Rudd was getting away with it.
我太太和我们特别喜欢北京，特别喜欢北京的气氛。
He was even immune to scandal, including an old story of a visit to a New York strip club.
It made no difference to people at all. It made him more human. So what?
This is the toolbox of the 21st century.
Kevin Rudd made climate change the symbolic point of difference between the two leaders.
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation.
I believed it then. I believe it now. And it's the truth. That's how I got there.
That's a tall bloke.
And what made it not boutique at the time was we were in the middle of a really serious drought.
We're on the interchange. How are you going?
Years of leadership divisions in the party were put aside.
Kevin Rudd, if an election was held this week, you would win easily.
Good morning, Pete. How are you? You having top of the morning tea?
Morning. How are you? Good to see you.
To win, Labor still had to convince voters they could manage the economy.
I don't think there had ever been a change of government when there were strong economic conditions.
I am an economic conservative.
Rudd's economic masterstroke came on the eve of the election.
This sort of reckless spending must stop.
I think at that moment the Australian public said, actually, I think we could make him Prime Minister.
I can say.
Sorry about that.
One of our panellists has attracted a bit of attention on the telly room floor.
Look, I think I've got to say, this is...
We can't yet call her Deputy Prime Minister-elect.
Well, I sat at the desk with Kerry O'Brien and with Nick Minchin with this incredible atmosphere just building in the tally room.
We need 7.7 off the extrapolation from last time. We're getting
We were looking at the other states and it was very clear the swing was on. And I remember Faulkner saying, we just have to wait and see whether Queensland's going to come home for us.
Swing of 7.8%. This is only the third time since the war that Labor's got a majority of the two-party preferred vote in Queensland.
Seeing the Queensland seats fall, seats like Ford and seats like Dawson and Flynn and those sorts of seats that people weren't necessarily on everybody's radar.
OK, I understand that Maxine McHugh, who at this stage is leading in the seat of Bennelong, the Prime Minister's seat, is about to make an appearance.
He's gone.
He's Prime Minister, but about to concede. This is the John Howard who came into Parliament 33 years ago.
Labor won by 18 seats, 9 in Queensland.
OK, guys. I want to thank my deputy, Julia Gillard. She has been fantastic as the deputy leader of the Australian Labor Party. She'll be fantastic as the deputy Prime Minister of Australia.
Kevin's just done a remarkable job in the less than 12 months he's been leader, and a remarkable job during the campaign.
Great support.
He's just, amazing, and intellectual grasp, touch with the Australian community. You couldn't possibly ask for better.
Tomorrow, and I say this to the team, we roll up our sleeves.
There was this one moment where Kevin Rudd gets up in his victory speech.
You can have a strong cup of tea if you want in the meantime. Even an ice Vovo on the way through.
And he does the whole, everyone take a shower in an ice Vovo, calm down, nothing to see here.
But the celebration should stop there. We have a job of work to do.
And I just remember a few of the activists turning to me and saying, what on earth are we going to do now?
4 days later, the VIP jet touched down at Fairburn Air Force Base. Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard returned to Canberra as Prime Minister and Deputy.
It was looking terrific. We won convincingly, defeated a Prime Minister.
Colleagues, the Leader of the Federal Parliament, Labor Party, Kevin Rudd.
In the victorious Labor caucus, there were 38 MPs new to Parliament.
Mate, good to have you on board.
For the first time in 100 years, the leader of the party, not the factions, was given the power to choose his own ministry.
The abuse of union-based factional power had gone on for far too long. We're not blind to some political realities, but you couldn't justify having people in significant positions who didn't have the ability.
Rudd's choices left some newly arrived factional heavyweights with thwarted ambitions.
And that is our mission to the future.
Former union leader Bill Shorten was left out of the ministry.
lying ahead of us this 3 years.
I actually regarded Bill then as one of the hopes of the side.
Can I say...
The Prime Minister thought he was marginalising Bill Shorten by putting him in the disabilities portfolio.
And I salute the efforts...
That was a silly approach to take. Why alienate someone who you think is a potential political threat? It's better to keep them closer, in my view.
I wasn't swept up with the excitement at all. I was very respectful of him for the energy that he put into campaigning and winning. But as we approached government in that period, shortly after the election in November 2007, I was actually quite apprehensive. I thought, how's this going to work out?
One of Kevin Rudd's key election promises was fulfilled on the first sitting day of the new parliament. An apology which John Howard had refused to make to the stolen generations. Their representatives gathered at the private entrance to the Prime Minister's courtyard.
They were all just standing, about 100 Aboriginal people, very shy. Of course, they're in this space where they had never been before. He called them forward and met every single one of them, one by one, with a kiss or a handshake.
I'm Kevin. What's your name? Hi, Jean. Where you come from? Okay.
It was incredible to see so many stolen generation people here, many of them quite old, some quite frail, welcomed into our Parliament House.
God bless you for it. Thank you, appreciate it.
Many of them feeling like this was the first time that their lifetime of pain had been truly acknowledged by the country that they lived in.
G'day, mate. I'm Kevin. Good to see you. Good to have you here. Some have asked, why apologise? Let me begin to answer by telling the Parliament just a little of one person's story. An elegant, eloquent and wonderful woman in her 80s who shared some of her story with me when I called round to see her just a few days ago.
Then I looked through the window and, hey, Christine, look, there's a car coming down the road there and it's got Australian flag flying and it's got number 1 on the number plate.
He was incredibly respectful. He was very patient. He didn't say very much. He let her talk. Occasionally he'd encourage her.
Sometime around 1932, when she was about 4, she remembers the coming of the welfare men.
I think he was touched because, all mothers got feelings for their children. And Mum fretted for me to the day she died. Right, she was chasing that truck after when the government came and picked us up and took us away from our Aboriginal families.
And that's the last memory you have of her?
Yeah, chasing that truck crying. Yeah.
Her mum tried clinging to the sides of the truck as her children were taken away to the bungalow in Alice, all in the name of protection.
Well, still get feeling. Yeah.
To the stolen generations, I say the following. As Prime Minister of Australia, I am sorry. On behalf of the Government of Australia, I am sorry. On behalf of the Parliament of Australia, I am sorry. And I offer you this apology without qualification.
He did deliver the apology, which people had been calling for more than 10 years. He mended terrible broken hearts by delivering that apology, and nobody else can ever take that away from him. He did it.
I remember presenting to him not long after the apology. So things were still going exceptionally well there. People's expectations of him were through the roof, and he was aware of that. I remember walking out of Kirribilli House with him and him saying to me, what are we going to do about these expectations? People think I can walk on water, and I can't.
Rudd's first big test was coming.
The next stop is Wall Street.
In early 2008, the gathering storm in the US financial system was beyond the horizon for most Australians. In Canberra, Treasury Secretary Ken Henry took a call from the Prime Minister's office.
Then I got a call to go out to Fairbairn and get on the plane.
My attitude is that when you're flying, this is work time.
The Prime Minister leant across the small table that separated us and said, so tell me, what is the worst thing that can happen? I had no idea what he was talking about. So I asked, well, Prime Minister, what, in respect of what?
Okay, Ken, how is all this going to unfold out of subprime, the subprime crisis in the United States? What is the worst case scenario for us?
Well, you know, Prime Minister, the absolute worst case scenario is that it gets to the point where nobody anywhere in the world is prepared to lend Australia anything.
What did you think about the questions that he was asking?
I thought that he was jumping the gun in asking the questions. I didn't think we were at the point where those questions needed to be asked.
Number one priority is the stability of our financial system.
The troubled Bear Stearns investment
moment is the likelihood of more volatility.
Could be on the verge of panic.
2 weeks later, one of America's biggest investment banks, Bear Stearns, was rescued on the brink of collapse.
Catastrophic
the biggest challenge confronting financial markets.
I've never seen anything like it all my life.
We're in challenging times.
So it's, okay, who's going to be next?
In the tense days that followed, the Prime Minister flew to Washington.
The core economic reason for my visit abroad is to speak with the US administration.
One of his first meetings was with the man in the eye of the storm, US Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson.
It stood out because a number of people were concerned, but this was the Prime Minister of Australia, a long ways away, coming in to my office and wanting to have a serious discussion about what was going on. And he understood not just the politics, he understood the economics.
Get started. Thank you.
Paulson sought to explain to me why they had intervened in the way in which they'd done on Bear Stearns. His prognosis was very, very guarded.
I had felt that if Bear Stearns had gone, you know, that the financial system would have collapsed and it would have been economic Armageddon. He knew something that I knew, which was the Australian banks were very dependent upon wholesale funding. And so a collapse of the banking system in the US and Europe would have been very problematic for Australia.
It was a worldwide challenge that required round-the-clock attention and with enormous complexity. The global financial crisis became the Prime Minister's raison d'etre for that period. It was very well suited to him and he was very well suited to it.
Before the global financial crisis really hit, already there were some concerns amongst the colleagues, and I shared these concerns, that Kevin had kept, you know, a lot of the operating style from the days of campaigning in opposition, and it wasn't fitting well in government. Then the global financial crisis hits, and it's a crisis where centralised command and control style decision-making was called for, and Kevin excelled at it.
Decisions were made by the government's senior ministers, Rudd, Gillard, Swan and Tanner, who became known as the Gang of Four. Could you have done it with a full cabinet? Could you have run our response to the GFC?
No.
Why not?
No. It simply would have been impossible to get everybody in the right place at the right time. And it would have proved an overwhelming distraction. You know, no government would run a national security crisis that way, and they don't.
What was the dynamic like between the four at the time?
Oh, I guess, you know, there were times when you'd have all four in the room for an extended period of time. There'd be times when you'd start off with four and late into the night there'd only be one left.
And who was the one?
No points for guessing who that was.
During his overseas trips, Julia Gillard was acting Prime Minister.
The out-of-touch, out-to-lunch Liberal Party.
And receiving praise for her efficiency.
You never bothered putting something you needed Prime Ministerial sign-off for into the PM's office until you knew Julia was going to be in the chair.
So you were obviously travelling a great deal during this period. How much were you relying on Julia Gillard as your fill-in Prime Minister back home?
A lot, because what I wanted to happen longer term was for Julia to replace me as Australia's first female Prime Minister.
It sounds a little bit too perfect. There isn't a leader in the world who doesn't feel some irritation at their deputy doing a brilliant job in their absence.
No, perfectly relaxed.
Just woke up to news of financial disaster.
Banks go deeper and deeper and deeper into debt, promising.
The financial Armageddon feared since the bailout of Bear Stearns had arrived.
Everything you hear from us.
So the greed that has driven our market.
The fourth largest investment bank in America went bankrupt.
Wall Street got us into this mess.
With $70 billion in bad assets, there was no rescuer for Lehman Brothers. A disaster years in the making of greed and risky lending in the American housing market finally unravelled.
Once in a century type of event.
15th of September, Lehman Brothers goes over, and basically the global economy is on the precipice.
Kevin Rudd prepared to fly to New York.
You're going to New York this week. What will that achieve? Shouldn't you be here looking after the shop?
The number one topic for debate among heads of government will be the content of a further global response to the global financial crisis. That's a principal reason why I'm in New York, and I believe it's my responsibility to do so.
That week after Lehman was an amazing week because we had 5 or 6 things going on continually. We had a number of other institutions close to failure. Morgan Stanley very close, and if they'd gone, Goldman Sachs wouldn't have been far behind.
Hey, Mike, please pick up GIG.
The financial system is splitting apart at the seams. Funding for financial institutions is drying up. Markets are volatile.
And then we had our money markets imploding. And that was the closest, I think, we came to the abyss.
A meeting of the UN General Assembly had brought the world's leaders to New York. Kevin Rudd and British Prime Minister Gordon Brown organised an impromptu leaders' summit on the sidelines.
Kevin Rudd was one of the first leaders who realised that we were in a long-term crisis that was quite fundamental, that had ramifications right across the world.
The venue that they were able to organise was in the Waldorf Astoria, pretty close to midnight.
We had decided that this financial crisis was far deeper than people had imagined it to be, that there had to be coordinated international action to deal with it, and that we would have to set up an organisation that was capable of doing so, which eventually became the G20. You know, Kevin was absolutely central to these discussions.
The bottom line is we needed a fully functioning G20 to coordinate the global responses, but also this, for everyone to agree that we're not going to repeat the mistakes of the 30s and whack up trade barriers against each other.
Washington, UK Embassy. We all recognised that it was probably the most important meeting that was taking place in New York that week and for many weeks.
By the time the Prime Minister returned to Australia days later, another US bank had gone under. Then Congress rejected a $7 trillion bailout.
The motion is not adopted.
The legislation has failed. The crisis has not gone away.
The day that was knocked back in the Congress, you could actually feel the earth shaking.
Kevin Rudd put his economics team on a crisis footing.
It was very clear to us when Lehman Brothers fell over that all of the planning and all of the discussing that we'd had been doing for some months, all of the wargaming, was going to be necessary.
Well, I'll tell you this. I think it is extremely likely that he was better prepared for any of this stuff than any political leader anywhere else in the world.
As predicted months earlier on the flight with Ken Henry, the flow of foreign capital into Australia had dried up.
We went for weeks with the Australian banks. They couldn't borrow money from anybody.
And if an Australian bank could not roll over its debt, it would have frozen the arteries of the Australian economy overnight.
The banks simply unable to get hold of the funds to lend to the Australian household sector to continue with mortgage lending.
The Reserve Bank made a deep cut to interest rates.
100 basis points.
One of the largest point falls.
It's spiralling closer towards a deep global recession.
There's a bit of an air of panic about it.
We are dealing with extraordinary economic times.
Right now experiencing a market crash.
Naked fear and panic.
DEFCON 1 in the banking system. On the Friday of that week, the ATMs and around the country actually were starting to run out of money.
There were stories of senior business people walking out of banks with suitcases full of cash. I don't exaggerate. We're talking a lot of cash. I mean, we're talking millions of dollars.
In that moment, you honestly didn't know whether, as rational as it would be, that banks could open their doors and there'd be a run on the banks with, riots and fights in the streets. I mean, all of that seemed heart-stoppingly possible.
The Prime Minister convened an urgent weekend meeting in Canberra.
It's ricocheting into our banks and therefore our workplaces and into our living rooms and potentially our jobs. So we needed to convey the message to the Australian public that this was just no ordinary weekend. This was a big one.
Wayne Swan joined the meeting by phone from the US.
On the Friday of that week, I was on Wall Street and I met with one CEO of a large investment bank who sat there and said, look, we're just waiting for the cavalry to arrive.
The question in Canberra was whether to offer a government guarantee to Australian banks.
This was a really big decision. If you get it right, no one will thank you because you avoid a crisis and no one experienced the crisis. If you get it wrong and say one of these institutions does fall over through whatever happened, then you'll be held forever to account.
Afternoon, everybody. The Australian government will guarantee all deposits, whatever their size, in all Australian banking institutions for 3 years. Banks, building societies, credit unions.
The other decision to emerge out of the marathon meeting was a stimulus package. Billions of dollars to keep the economy firing at Christmas.
We knew we had to put a floor under confidence and the only way to do that was to make sure that Australians had a decent Christmas.
The best thing to do was to make sure that you got cash in the hands of households as soon as you possibly could, and it couldn't be a small amount of cash. I did say, go early, go hard, go households.
No sleep.
It was the first stimulus package announced in the world since the crisis began. China, the US, Canada and major European nations followed in the months ahead.
Ready to rock and roll? Good.
The Prime Minister and his Treasurer fronted the media.
Today, the government is announcing a $10.4 billion economic security strategy to deal with the challenges of the global financial crisis.
At the end of the day, it's somebody has to make the judgment. And in the political system that we have, that person has to be the Prime Minister. Can't be anybody else. I said to him subsequently that I thought his instincts were better than mine. And I still think that.
We all sort of inherently knew that there was this, potential liability for Labor. Inevitably, there would be someone who got that stimulus payment that the media then saw, taking it down the pokies or coming out of the pub with, slabs and slabs of alcohol on their shoulder, and it would play out as a waste and mismanagement story.
This is a Christmas message from Kevin Rudd. Spend for Australia.
Payments of about $1,000.
They don't spend it, they're likely to put their job at risk.
Package is designed to kickstart the economy and keep the nation out.
Australia was the only developed country having a happy Christmas. The British and American economies went into recession. There were fears Australia would follow.
The officials in the Treasury were of the view that even after you had done all these things, we were still going to have a very deep recession.
And what would that have meant?
Well, it means hundreds of thousands of people losing jobs.
The International Monetary Fund has predicted for 2009 the worst year for the global economy since the war.
So we knew we had to put in place a pipeline of work and additional cash payments as we went through February, March, April, May, June, July of the next year.
Labor had inherited a budget surplus of almost $20 billion, helped by the proceeds of the mining boom. Another big stimulus package would put them heavily into deficit. A big moment for a politician who'd labelled himself an economic conservative.
And of course, what was in his mind was abundantly clear, well, he made no secret of it, was, so I go down in history as the Prime Minister who's pushed Australia back into budget deficit.
Was it particularly difficult for a Labor Prime Minister?
Oh, yeah. There was no doubt about that. Absolutely no doubt about that. Their predecessors had a budget deficit. It's unremarked. But for this group of ministers, Labor ministers, this was very big. This was very big.
Right. The Government of Australia is today launching an unprecedented $42 billion nation-building and jobs plan to support jobs and to invest in Australia's long-term economic future. On the question of the deficit itself, nobody likes being in deficit, and I don't like being in deficit at all. This is not a question of choice.
Nobody will ever know whether it was the right amount or whether a larger amount would have given Australia an even better unemployment outcome, or whether we could have achieved satisfactory economic outcomes with a smaller package. Nobody will ever know.
The opposition will vote against this package in the House and in the Senate.
The opposition had supported the Christmas cash handouts. Now they dug in their heels.
It's the right decision. Yeah. Somebody has to stand up for fiscal discipline.
What you have embarked upon today is to vote against the biggest building program in every primary school in the nation. In the electorate of North Sydney, in the electorate of Curtin, in the electorate of Wentworth,
throughout Adelaide, throughout Brisbane, throughout Queensland, every state of the country. This is going to be a very long day.
Joe Hockey was right. The stimulus debate raged all night.
Saturday will be a day of extreme fire.
Total fire ban in the entire state.
But by morning, news of a more elemental threat facing Victoria was filling the airwaves.
We are in almost uncharted territory. Time to implement your personal bushfire plan.
Start will spread very quickly, be very hard to contain.
By late morning on Saturday, fires were burning across the state.
Whereabouts are you, King Lake?
King Lake.
Yeah.
It's just black like a storm cloud, and it's just completely blocked out the sun.
Flame everywhere. Trees exploding, gas tanks exploding, buildings on fire. It's very, very, very serious. Most of the town's going up. There will be multiple houses gone, including mine.
173 people were killed.
Whereabouts are we?
Kevin and I went out to Whittlesea, and a lot of people had come down the mountain and were still in a terrible state of shock. I remember one man standing there really not knowing what had happened to him.
Everything we've worked for is gone.
All right, mate. There you go.
And then for the next, I can't remember how many days, we would go in and out to different parts of the bushfire-affected communities. So I saw it day after day. He met a mother whose husband had been killed, and she had a little boy. And just the way he was with them was so lovely, but as it turned out, sometime later, without anybody knowing, I didn't find out till even after the event, he'd been off to see this mother and the little boy just to offer comfort.
We are shaped by our circumstances and by the people who has brought us up. My mother was a woman of natural compassion, and she could not walk by somebody in need without extending not just a kind word but doing something about it. And so you can't grow up in that sort of environment, particularly as she became my sole parent, and not be affected by it. And there's a great line, you know, in the history of Australia by Manning Clark, where he described Deakin, perhaps pejoratively, as a man with a woman's heart.
So how do you put those two things together? You know, this reputation that he has for being hard on people and careless of their feelings and their lives, and that person you saw there.
People are complex.
As Australia struggled with a domestic tragedy, the global financial crisis continued to deepen.
Wall Street under occupation. We are taking over. We have
32 of the world's developed nations fell into recession. Despite the crisis, the government pushed ahead with its most complex economic reform, the design of an emissions trading scheme.
This was the first time that this had been attempted in our economy, and it is a massive, massive reform.
There were days where we'd meet for 6 or 8 hours about economic policy in the GFC, and they'd wheel out all our thousands of pages of briefing about the GFC, and they'd wheel in thousands of pages of briefing about carbon pollution.
We had to send a public service team, for example. They had to get into the bowels of companies like BHP Billiton, and not just the whole company, but go down to the steelworks in Port Kembla. Work with the company on identifying how much greenhouse gas was produced. No one's done this before. The Europeans tried this in their emissions trading scheme and failed. We couldn't fail.
The Rudd government government stands for the biggest debt the Australian people have had since World War II. The Rudd government stands for a failure in fiscal policy.
The argument over the stimulus rolled on. In June, Australia's critical economic figures were released. A verdict on the government's handling of the crisis.
Just been handed a note that reveals that the Australian economy grew in the March quarter.
I remember the information came through and everyone in the Prime Minister's office spilled into the corridors.
It's the sort of result that makes public life so worthwhile. All the people who kept their jobs and all those small businesses that would have hit the fence.
Australia is the fastest growing economy of all the major advanced economies. Australia has the lowest debt and deficit of all the major advanced economies. And Australia is the only advanced economy, as of today, not in recession.
Winter crept over the capital. The Cold War on economic management gave way to a season of scandal and a fatal blunder by the opposition leader.
In that hothouse environment of Canberra, people do crazy things. Malcolm Turnbull did a particularly crazy thing.
A little-known Treasury official called Godwin Gretsch took centre stage.
You're actually squashing everyone here.
Yes, I have had representations from the Prime Minister's office and from the Treasurer's office who have simply been seeking to refer dealership cases that they've become aware of.
The questions were about Ozcar, a fund set up to rescue car dealerships in the financial crisis. Gretsch claimed the Prime Minister and the Treasurer had sought access to the fund to benefit a mate. The car dealer was Queensland Labor supporter John Grant.
And look, when you say approaches, were they by phone calls, emails, letters? How did those approaches?
Phone calls and the occasional email.
And the Prime Minister's office? How was that?
I'm going back from memory. It was mostly emails.
The Leader of the Opposition. Has the Prime Minister or his office or anyone on his behalf made representations on behalf of a car dealership owned by or associated with John Grant to Ozcar?
Yeah, I just scratched my head and turned around to Treasurer Swan and said, what the hell's all that about?
I don't understand the concern.
What the government didn't know was that Godwin Gretsch was a Liberal Party mole.
I'm a public servant and
all of the Prime Minister's senior staff, lots of the kind of senior cabinet ministers in a room watching the proceedings on TV.
Now we're at the crunch point as to whether or not there's been representations from the Prime Minister's office, namely one Andrew Charlton to Godwin Gretsch.
I think I was having some tea and he said Andrew Charlton, and I think I might have spat that morning tea on the ground.
But my recollection is that there was a short email from the PMO to me, which very simply alerted me to the case of John Grant. But I don't have the email.
Yeah, similar to the terms that I suggested.
Gretsch had shown the email to Malcolm Turnbull. Proof, Gretsch claimed, of the Prime Minister's involvement. An email to Godwin Gretsch from Rudd's advisor, Andrew Charlton.
Hi, everyone. Okay. All set? Is everyone right?
Malcolm Turnbull thought that he was within an inch of the Prime Ministership. He thought he had evidence that the Prime Minister had been corrupt.
We've seen extraordinary evidence before a Senate committee today The Prime Minister and the Treasurer have used their offices and taxpayers' resources to seek advantage for one of their mates and then lied about it to the Parliament. If the Prime Minister and the Treasurer cannot immediately justify their actions to the Australian people, they have no choice but to resign.
We had every single email that Andrew Charlton had ever received or sent printed out and checked by hand by two separate people to make sure we didn't miss it. And it was at that point the momentum started to shift.
If when Parliament resumes in 24 hours, Mr Turnbull fails to produce this email upon which his entire case against the government is based, for authentication, he has no alternative but to stand in the Parliament, apologise and to resign.
On Monday morning, ministers lined up to attack the opposition leader.
He is prepared to say anything and do anything to take this chair.
It was electric.
And how he should resign.
You'd had a call by Malcolm Turnbull for the Prime Minister and the Treasurer to resign. And you had rumours about police raids at Goblin Gretsch's home.
Rudd's prediction of a fake email's been confirmed.
And it's a fake. Police
Mr Gretsch has been questioned by federal police, who suspect he was involved in
the email had been found and that it's a fake.
The forged email was discovered on Gretsch's home computer. Turnbull had been deceived, along with everyone else.
Malcolm Turnbull's popularity ratings plummeted. And that meant from that day until Malcolm Turnbull ceased to be the opposition leader, his effectiveness as the leader of the opposition was fatally weakened.
Meet the man himself. Please welcome the real Kevin Rudd, PM. Hey, now I'm looking to get myself a car. You know any good dealers in Queensland? I could.
Not offhand, but I'm sure Malcolm Turnbull could email you some suggestions.
Kevin Rudd's popularity soared. He led Malcolm Turnbull 65 to 18 as preferred Prime Minister. He appeared untouchable.
Would have I preferred Rudd to face Turnbull in the election? Yes, because I think Rudd was very well matched against Turnbull. There's only one speed in politics when it comes to your opponents, and that is you take every gun you got and you fire every bullet at them, and you don't stop shooting until they're gone.
But one decision Rudd made that winter would have far-reaching consequences for his leadership.
Your Excellency, I now present Senator Mark Victor Arbib to be an Executive Councillor.
He promoted into the ministry a factional warlord who'd helped orchestrate his rise to power.
I, Mark Victor Arbib, do swear that I will well and truly serve the Commonwealth of Australia, her land and her people, in the office of Parliamentary Secretary for Government Service Delivery. So help me God.
Arbib was given a job working alongside Julia Gillard on the rollout of the stimulus packages.
I think the fact that she developed a close working relationship with Mark Arbib, is hugely significant. The comfort of working with her and the comfort of the officers working together so closely was hugely significant for a pretty major decision, being someone from the New South Wales right, backing so strongly a woman from Victoria from the left.
People would put Mark into the class of being a, party functionary and apparatchik who'd come into Parliament. I actually came to see more of him than that. When you've got your really hard question, what you've got to do is ask Mark.
How many people are there in the House of Representatives?
Well, I'm in the Senate, it's 150.
Mark Arbib was a kingmaker from the powerful New South Wales right, the dominant faction behind Kevin Rudd's push for the leadership of the Labor Party.
Well, I was the General Secretary of the Labor Party in New South Wales, so yeah, I had a bit of influence in the New South Wales Labor Party.
Well, he certainly practised in the dark arts, and I think it's fair to say that he brought New South Wales Labor Party culture with him to the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party, and I don't think that was a great contribution to bring.
As of then, I had no cause to distrust Mr Arbib. I had no cause to distrust Julia. I was not to know that they'd become something of an internal cabal within the operation.
$2 million for school hall. A ferocious waste of taxpayers.
They're discovering a whole range of things that they're not happy about.
Yeah, look, absolutely. You know, as highlighted by...
The government's $14.7 billion school building program was coming under intense scrutiny from the media.
Well, what you had was News Limited, in particular the Australian, highlighting issues that were there with the BER program. But we have to put that in perspective. Of the 9,500 projects, less than 3% were the subject of any complaint to the department.
Too small to accommodate all of the 300. They're complaining about being ripped off.
And there seems to be some rorting has gone on.
We kept trying to sell it, but you couldn't get a positive story up about the building the education revolution for love or money.
The stimulus programs were making huge demands across the government.
My view at the time was that, and it remains my view, was that there were too many measures.
One of the smaller measures, money for roof insulation or pink bats, became the most controversial.
I thought it was a useful thing to do both for stimulus and for the environment.
Everyone was under pressure to roll this thing out.
Everyone's working overtime. Everyone's working their guts out to make these things work. So mistakes can be made. Yes, they're going to be made.
If you're going to hand over $1,600 to an installer to go out to someone's home to install insulation for free for the householder, they've got to at least have the life experience and experience the real economy to say, well, shit, that's open to abuse, isn't it?
Mistakes turned to tragedy. Thousands rushed to join the largely unregulated industry. In October and November, 3 men were killed installing roof insulation. Matthew Fuller and 16-year-old Reuben Barnes were electrocuted. Marcus Wilson died of heat exposure. Mitchell Sweeney was electrocuted 2 months later.
The profound tragedy of young men, being killed during the process of installing insulation and others being injured, in some cases very severely. The tragedy for those families, I felt that really was bad.
When you had tragedies such as those which occurred for the 4 families in the home insulation program, I felt it personally. With the business of political life is that you accept responsibility for the good things and the bad.
In the government's first year, the issue of asylum seekers was low-key. 7 boats arrived in Australia. But in Rudd's second year, 60 boats arrived, carrying 2,726 people. Under pressure from the increase, in October, Kevin Rudd made a unilateral decision to stop boats on their way to Australia. At Australia's request, the Jaya Lestari was intercepted and taken to port by the Indonesian Navy. A few days later, 78 Sri Lankans rescued from a small boat were transferred to the Australian customs ship, the Oceanic Viking.
I got a phone call from the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff to advise me that Kevin Rudd and The Indonesian President, SBY, had come to an arrangement where a group of asylum seekers would be transferred by Australian vessel to Indonesia, and that was done without consultation with the relevant ministers and certainly without the calling of a National Security Committee, a cabinet meeting.
If there was a breakdown in the command structure within the government about which ministerial office was engaged or not, it is difficult to sustain that a Prime Minister has to physically pick up the telephone to every affected senior bureaucrat and minister and say, this is what's happening.
The Oceanic Viking moored off Bintan Island, but the asylum seekers refused to get off.
Days of talks between Canberra and Jakarta have failed to resolve which
11
country
days
will
and
take them.
counting. 78 Sri Lankans remain.
Government insists it won't bring the Sri Lankans to Australia and won't rule out
Viking
using force.
standoff has entered its second week.
The opposition was strongly playing to a loss of control of our borders. Now, there's nothing about this politics that's new, but it was being turbocharged by those nightly images of asylum seekers holding the government, the nation, apparently hostage on a boat that they wouldn't get off.
We'd had to bow to both Indonesian sensibilities and to the demands of the asylum seekers.
The month-long Oceanic Viking saga is finally over. The remaining 56 Sri Lankan asylum seekers on board have nearly finished disembarking.
Despite subsequent denials by the government, the Sri Lankans from the Oceanic Viking got special treatment. Speedy settlement of their refugee claims.
The Oceanic Viking was really important because it was another dot around incompetence and Labor starting to lose control. So you had BER, you had BATS, you had debt escalating, and then you had boats and this Oceanic Viking. It was just another dot that started to create a picture of Labor as not able to run things.
Any message for Australia or Kevin Rudd?
There's Kevin Rudd a little bit out of control, and everything he's touching isn't seeming to go quite right.
More than anything else, the Oceanic Viking told me where our decision-making processes had degenerated to.
The broader criticism of Rudd's decision-making style was his continued reliance on the Gang of Four, at the expense of the full cabinet. Coming out of the global financial crisis, and I accept it's very difficult to pick a moment where it's over, but nonetheless, why wasn't the Gang of Four disbanded?
The four-person central committee of me, Wayne, Kevin and Lindsay, it wasn't disbanded because, I think in Kevin's view in particular, he preferred to do business that way.
That is the most creative reconstruction of a political memory I've ever heard. I remember Julia in particular enjoyed and liked the relative secrecy of that small gathering.
I consistently put the view that we needed to move to a more regular decision-making style, and increasingly I discussed that with Wayne Swan because we both knew what it was like to be in the middle of this decision-making chaos.
There was no sign publicly of the strains inside the government, but the key relationships were shifting, including Julia Gillard's relationship with Wayne Swan.
When I came into Parliament, I didn't know Wayne Swan. I probably had a little bit of a sense that I was a policy person and he was a machine person, which is probably unfair to Wayne. Bit of a hard man, he had that reputation.
It was in that period that I started to work more closely with Julia because there was a traffic jam emerging in terms of our policy agenda as we went through the end of 2009.
As the problems for the government started to accumulate, increasingly Wayne and I did something that we hadn't done across all of our lives in Parliament together, which is actually seek each other out. So we started having, direct policy and political discussions.
How much were they about what are we going to do about Kevin?
A lot of them were about that, about managing Kevin. None of them were leadership discussions. None of them were leadership discussions about replacing Kevin.